The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Eleanor would remember afterward, not because the day had any particular significance, but because she had been planning to walk to the village to settle the butcher's account, and the letter made that errand unnecessary. There was no money for the butcher now. There was, in fact, no plan that held any longer at all. She stood at the window of the Marsh cottage with the paper in her hands, reading it a second time and then a third, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more manageable. They did not. Sir Aldous Pembrey, through his solicitor in Hereford, demanded payment in full of the outstanding mortgage note of £240 within 30 days, failing which he would proceed to take possession of the property situated in the village of Ashvale Crossing, Herefordshire, in the county of the same. The cottage, her father's cottage, the single room where he had kept his law books and his annotated Bible, and the good chair that Eleanor had never been permitted to sit in as a child, and now could not bring herself to move. She set the letter on the writing desk beside the window, smoothed it flat, and went to put the kettle on. This was who Eleanor Marsh was at 23 years old and 3 months into her grief. She smoothed the letter flat and went to put the kettle on. The cottage stood at the edge of Ashvale village along the Wye Valley Road, a white rendered building with a slate roof and a garden that her father had kept in better order than his finances. He had been a country solicitor, respected in the district and only modestly prosperous, and when he died in January of a lung fever that had come and gone 3 winters running before it finally held, he had left Eleanor the cottage, £3 14 in a tin above the kitchen press, and the mortgage note of £240 that Sir Aldous Pembrey held, with the patience of a man who had been waiting for the elder Mr. Marsh to die. Eleanor had known about the note. She had found it among her father's papers on the 2nd day after the funeral, tucked inside the envelope from Pembrey's solicitor, alongside 2 years of correspondence that she read in its entirety sitting on the floor of his study in her black dress, the fire unlit because she had not remembered to lay it. The note had been drawn up 6 years earlier when her father's practice fell quiet during a bad season, and Pembrey had offered terms that seemed reasonable at the time, at a rate of 4.5% on the balance, with the principal due in 10 years or on demand if the borrower died. Her father had not quite lived to see the 10 years out. Pembrey himself Eleanor knew by sight and by reputation. He was a baronet of middling acres in the next valley, a man of 50 with a florid complexion and a manner of addressing women that managed to be both courtly and acquisitive. He rode a good horse. He attended the Michaelmas assemblies. He had been introduced to Eleanor twice at such events and had looked at her each time in a way that took inventory without committing to purchase. She understood by the time the kettle boiled on that Tuesday that the 30-day notice was not purely a financial instrument. It was an opening position. Lady Hargrove arrived from Bath 4 days later, as though the letter had been sent to her as well, which perhaps it had. She was Eleanor's mother's older sister, a widow of independent means and decided opinions, who had taken a theoretical interest in Eleanor's welfare since Mr. Marsh's death, and a practical interest since the arrival of Pembrey's notice. She descended from her hired carriage with 2 trunks, a lady's maid named Cooper, and a set of views about Eleanor's situation that she presented over supper on the first evening with the directness of someone reading a legal brief. "You cannot keep the cottage," Lady Hargrove said. She was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and a spine that had never accommodated uncertainty. £240 is not a sum you can raise. Your father's practice has no ongoing value now that he is gone, and his books and papers are worth perhaps £8 at auction. The sum is out of reach. Eleanor had said nothing to this because it was true. Sir Aldous has expressed a willingness to discuss the matter, Lady Hargrove continued. I have had a letter from his man in Hereford. He would consider the note retired in exchange for an arrangement that I think you will find, on reflection, to be not unreasonable." Eleanor had looked at her aunt steadily across the supper table and waited. "Marriage," Lady Hargrove said, and picked up her fork. "His first wife died in childbed 4 years ago. He requires an heir and a competent household. You are not without advantages, Eleanor. You are educated and presentable, and your father's name, whatever his means, is not a liability in the district." Eleanor said, "I will think on it." And Lady Hargrove had accepted this as compliance, which it was not. It rained on the Friday of that same week, a hard, pelting rain that came across the valley in the afternoon, with no more warning than a darkening at the tree line. Eleanor was returning from the Ashvale Estate Library, where Mrs. Fenn, the housekeeper, had on several occasions allowed her to borrow volumes from the collection, since the library itself was not then in active use. The new bailiff, she was told, had taken up residence at the estate lodge the week before in anticipation of the season's work, and the manor house itself stood largely closed, its master absent in London. Eleanor came around the curve of the Wye Valley Road where the old elm stood, and there she saw a man in a patched brown coat standing at the field gate with no hat and a horse whose saddle bore a leather satchel that was rapidly becoming soaked. He was examining one of the field drainage channels with the deliberate attention of someone who had forgotten about the rain, or who had decided that the rain was irrelevant to the work. He was tall, with the kind of stillness that seems expensive in a man who is doing manual assessment. She stopped. He looked up. "You'll catch your death," she said, which was not the most elegant opening she had ever produced, but it was what the situation called for. He regarded her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. "The drainage on the upper field has been backing up since September," he said. "I wanted to see it in rain." "You are the new bailiff," she said. "Mr. Robinson." "I am," he said. She reached into her basket and produced the coat she had carried against the cold, her father's heavy wool travelling coat that she had taken from his study 3 weeks before, because she could not leave it hanging there and could not yet put it away. It was a large coat, made for a larger man than her father had been in his last years, and she held it out across the gate without ceremony. "It won't fit well," she said, "but it's dry." He took it. He did not thank her immediately, which she noticed, and then he said, "That is generous," in a tone that was not performing gratitude but simply acknowledging a fact, as though generosity was a thing he had learned to assess accurately, and she had just passed his measurement. She walked home in the rain with her basket and her library book and her wet shoulders, thinking nothing in particular about Mr. Robinson, except that he had very clean hands for a bailiff. He came to return the coat 2 days later, carrying it folded across both arms as though it were a thing worth handling carefully. He knocked at the kitchen door rather than the front, which was where the bailiff's work generally brought him, and Eleanor answered it herself because Cooper was at the market and Lady Hargrove was writing letters in the parlour. "Your father's coat," he said. "Thank you." "Come in then," Eleanor said, because the morning was cold and there was tea made. He came in and sat at the kitchen table, and she set a cup in front of him without asking, and for a while they said nothing in particular, which was also a form of conversation that Eleanor had come to value since January. He asked about the cottage's drainage, which she found an odd subject, but one she happened to know something about, since she had been managing the property alone since her father fell ill. She told him that the south-facing wall took on damp in November, and that the garden well had been low since August. He listened with the same attentiveness he had given the field drainage channel in the rain, which was the full weight of his concentration, not a politeness. She had the peculiar sensation of being accurately perceived, which was not a feeling she had lately been given cause to expect. He finished his tea. He thanked her for it. He went back to the estate, 1 mile up the Wye Valley Road. He came by the Ashvale Library the following week while she was there, not, she thought, by arrangement, but because the library was also the estate record room, and the season's accounts required the old ledgers from the floor-to-ceiling shelves on the east wall. Eleanor was sitting at the reading table with a volume of natural history and the comfortable sense of being forgotten, which was her preferred condition in that room. Stephen arrived with the estate steward's key and an unhurried manner, and seemed neither surprised nor intrusive to find her there. He took the ledger he needed from the third shelf, settled at the far end of the table, and worked through his figures while she read. The fire was a good one. The room smelled of old paper and beeswax, and the particular damp wool scent of a November morning brought in on a coat. She turned her pages. He turned his. After some time he looked up and said, "The 1812 accounts show 60 acres more under cultivation than the current returns. Do you know what became of the eastern meadow?" She did, as it happened. Her father had handled a boundary dispute for the estate some years before. She told him what she knew, and he listened, and made a note, and asked a clarifying question. The exchange had the texture of a conversation between two people who were each accustomed to thinking precisely. And Eleanor noticed, driving home afterward in the cold, that she had not once performed anything during it. She had simply spoken and been heard. Lady Hargrove noticed her return with the directness of a woman whose antenna for female contentment had long been calibrated to detect anything resembling an alternative. "You have been at the estate library again," she said, not approvingly. "Mrs. Fenn allows it," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Fenn is a housekeeper. She does not set the terms of the estate's social obligations." Eleanor took off her coat and hung it at the door. "I borrowed a book," she said. "I will return it when I am finished." Lady Hargrove watched her cross the hall with the expression she wore when she was revising a calculation, and Eleanor went upstairs to change her shoes and tried not to examine why the afternoon had felt so different from any afternoon she had recently spent. The third time she saw Stephen on the estate grounds, he was overseeing the repair of the old stone wall along the north drive, directing 2 labourers from the village with a minimum of words and a quality of attention that made the work proceed faster than she would have expected. She was walking back from the village with a basket of provisions, and he fell into step beside her at the gate and walked the first quarter-mile without particular ceremony, and they talked about the dry stone technique the wall demanded, and then about whether the old kitchen garden on the south side of the manor had ever been put back into productive use. He had ideas about the kitchen garden. They were practical ideas, grounded in soil and light and seasonal timing, and Eleanor thought them good ones, and said so. And he accepted her assessment with the same directness with which she had offered it, neither dismissing her judgment, nor performing surprise at its quality. At the turning for the cottage lane he stopped, as the estate road and the cottage lane divided there, and she felt him pause a moment longer than the geography required, as though he were calculating something that had nothing to do with kitchen gardens. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I hope the matter of the cottage finds a better resolution than the one currently on offer." She looked at him. He had not asked her about it directly, but Mrs. Fenn would have told him, because Mrs. Fenn's knowledge of the district's affairs was encyclopedic and unsentimental, and a foreclosure on the solicitor's daughter's cottage was not a private matter in a village of 400. "So do I," she said, and turned toward home, and managed not to think about the precision of his phrasing until she was through the kitchen door. The overheard conversation came on a Thursday, when the light had been thin all day and the fire in the cottage parlour had smelled of damp wood since morning. Eleanor had gone to the estate library to return the natural history volume and to collect a copy of Cowper's poems that Mrs. Fenn had set aside for her, and she was halfway through the hall when she heard her aunt's voice from beyond the library door, and stopped. She was not snooping. She had no reason to expect her aunt to be in the estate library. Lady Hargrove had come on a morning call to Mrs. Fenn, which was not unusual, and had been shown into the library to wait, which was where the morning calls were received in the absence of the manor's master. Eleanor was simply standing in the hall when the words came through the old oak door, which had a gap at the threshold that the November draft made plain. "She is biddable enough if the alternative is made sufficiently clear," Lady Hargrove was saying, in the tone she used for assessments she considered settled. "The girl has no money and no realistic prospect of any. The cottage will go within the month. Once she is without shelter, she will see reason." A pause, and then the second voice, which Eleanor did not recognize. A man's voice with the flat precision of a professional, perhaps a solicitor. "And she is fully aware of Pembury's terms?" "She is aware," Lady Hargrove said. "She has a sentimental resistance to them, which is natural in a young woman of no practical experience. Sentiment does not survive cold weather and an empty larder. I expect her to come round by Christmas." Eleanor stood in the hall with Cowper's poems in her hands, and the gap at the library door letting through her aunt's voice like a draught, and she understood in that moment with a clarity that was almost physical that she had never been a niece to Lady Hargrove, not genuinely, not in the sense that the word implied affection or concern. She was a problem to be resolved, a debt instrument, as useful as the note itself, equally subject to terms. She set the Cowper volume on the hall table because her hands had gone unsteady, and walked out through the estate's side entrance into the cold of the afternoon, and kept walking until she reached the north wall where the repaired stonework was still pale and fresh against the older grey. And she sat on the low stone mounting block beside the gate and was very still for a time. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of his boots on the gravel drive, unhurried and even. And then he was beside her at the gate, not sitting, but stopped, and she had the sense that he had seen her from the lane and altered his direction without announcement. He said nothing at first. He stood at the gate and looked out at the valley the way a man looks at something he is responsible for. And Eleanor looked at the pale stone of the repaired wall and said, "She is waiting for me to lose the shelter before she expects the compliance." She had not meant to say it aloud. She was not in the habit of laying her internal weather before comparative strangers. But he did not receive it as a confidence to be managed or a distress to be solved. He received it as a fact she had named, accurately, and let the naming be enough. "What will you do?" he said. "I will not sign," she said, "whatever it costs." He turned and looked at her then, a sustained and direct attention that was not sympathy, or not only sympathy, but something she did not have an accurate word for. Something in the register of being witnessed by a person who considers the witnessing a matter of some consequence. "No," he said. "I did not think you would." She looked at him, at the clean line of his jaw and the steady quality of his hands resting on the gate, and she thought again, involuntarily, that he was a very strange sort of bailiff. The roses came on a Saturday morning, which was 3 days before Pembury arrived. She found them at the cottage door when she came down to unlock it, a small bunch of late-season roses from the Ashvale hothouse, pale yellow, with no card. Mrs. Fenn's work, perhaps. Or perhaps not. Eleanor put them in water in the kitchen window and told herself the question was unimportant, and spent the rest of the morning failing to convince herself of this. Sir Aldous Pembury arrived on Tuesday with his solicitor and the specific confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. He wore a grey coat of good cloth and carried a leather document case, and kissed Lady Hargrove's hand in the morning room with the ease of someone who had already decided the outcome. He had, Eleanor understood, been invited. Lady Hargrove had arranged the call as a formal occasion, with the writing desk prepared and the deed of the cottage laid out on it, and Cooper stationed in the passage in a way that made the room feel like a proceeding. Eleanor stood by the window. Pembrey presented the case without ceremony. The note of £240 was due. He had been most patient. There was a resolution available that would serve everyone's interests, that would retire the note, provide Miss Marsh with security and establishment, and settle the matter without recourse to legal proceedings and the unpleasantness those involved. He placed the document before her on the desk. His solicitor produced a pen. Lady Hargrove said, "Eleanor," in the tone that meant she was to be reasonable. Eleanor looked at the document. She looked at the pen in the solicitor's hand. She looked at Pembrey's expectant, florid face, and at her aunt's composed and implacable expression, and at the cottage deed beneath the document, her father's handwriting visible on the bottom corner, where he had signed it 6 years before, in a year when money had been short and the note had seemed the only path available. She said, "No." The room did not produce the response she had expected. Pembrey's expression shifted, not to anger, but to the slightly patient recalibration of a man who has extended terms before and finds it tedious to do so again. Lady Hargrove drew a breath that contained a great deal of architecture. "Eleanor," she said, "the cottage will be lost." "I know," Eleanor said. "No." She had not raised her voice. She did not perform the refusal. She stated it, simply and level, and stood by the window with her hands at her sides, and she thought of her father's coat draped over the gate in the rain, and the natural history book, and the kitchen garden, and the man who had said, "I did not think you would," with the weight of someone who had been watching carefully, and found his assessment confirmed. Pembrey said, "Miss Marsh, I urge you to reconsider." And she said, "I think not." And that was where the conversation ended, which was not where Pembrey had expected it to end. He turned to Lady Hargrove, who straightened and began to speak about Eleanor's circumstances, her lack of independent means, her father's debts, the unsentimentality of creditors, and Eleanor looked out the window at the estate road, 1 mile distant, where the morning was pale and cold, and waited for it to be over. It was Mrs. Fenn who came that afternoon. She arrived at the cottage door in her good black dress, and her housekeeper's manner, which combined warmth with precision in a way that Eleanor found steadying, and she said, "Miss Marsh, the bailiff asks whether you would come to the estate library this afternoon, if it's convenient." Eleanor looked at her. Mrs. Fenn had a particular quality of expression when she was withholding something, a composed and deliberate stillness that sat slightly above her usual composure. And Eleanor thought of it but said only, "At what hour?" 3 o'clock, Mrs. Fenn said. "I'll have the fire laid." She came at 3. The library was warm, the fire good, the pale afternoon light falling across the reading table in the way it did at this time of year, low and specific, making the dust in the air visible as it turned. Stephen was not at the table. He was standing by the east shelves with a letter in his hand, and when Eleanor came in, he turned and did not begin speaking immediately, which she had learned was how he operated when the thing to be said required some care. She waited. "I have made you a poor sort of neighbour," he said, "for these last weeks." "I thought you a decent enough neighbour," she said. "Better than most I have lately encountered." He looked at the letter in his hand and then at her, and she thought she saw in his expression something that had been held at a particular controlled distance, suddenly fail to stay at that distance. He said, "There are things I should have told you earlier." And she felt the air in the room change slightly, the way it does before a window is opened. She said, "Then tell them now." He did not get to begin because the morning room door at the far end of the hall opened, and she heard Lady Hargrove's voice carrying through the house with the confidence of someone who had followed her niece at the prescribed 10 minutes interval and then the heavier measured tread of Pembrey behind her, and the solicitor's lighter step, and the whole machinery of the morning's unfinished business arriving in the hall. Mrs. Fenn's voice cut across all of them, warm and clear and entirely deliberate, as she came from the kitchen passage into the hall and addressed the man standing by the east shelves in the Ashvale library with the folded letter in his hand. "Your Grace," she said, "Sir Aldous Pembrey and Lady Hargrove and Mr. Carver of Pembrey's solicitors have called on Miss Marsh. I thought you would wish to know." The room did what rooms do when the air is suddenly required to rearrange itself. Lady Hargrove made a sound that was not quite a word. Pembrey, to his credit, or perhaps simply by reflex, said, "I beg your pardon?" in the tone of a man who suspected he had misheard and was very much hoping he had. Eleanor stood at the reading table and looked at the man she had known as the Ashvale bailiff, the man whose tea she had made at her kitchen table, whose collar she had seen wet with November rain, whose clean hands on the estate gate she had noticed and then refused to account for. She looked at him, and she saw in the arrangement of all of it, the coat and the library and the kitchen garden, the way he had listened and the precision with which he had spoken, the thing she had been looking at without letting herself name it. He was looking back at her. He was not looking at Pembrey. He was not looking at Lady Hargrove. He was looking at Eleanor with the full and particular attention he had been giving her since the gate in the rain, and she felt the weight of it now differently, not as the attention of a bailiff managing a district problem, but as something considerably more deliberate and considerably older than the 6 weeks of their acquaintance. "Your name," Pembrey said, his voice recalibrating from bored authority to something more careful, "is not Robinson." "Stephen Robinson is my mother's name," Stephen said, which was not quite an answer, but Pembrey was already looking at him with the expression of a man revising his inventory at speed. Mrs. Fenn said, without unnecessary elaboration, "His Grace the Duke of Ashvale," and clasped her hands in front of her apron, and permitted herself the smallest of smiles, a controlled, satisfied compression of the lips that she had, Eleanor suspected, been saving for some time. Lady Hargrove sat down on the hall chair. She did not choose to sit down. Her legs made the decision for her. Pembrey's solicitor, Mr. Carver, became very interested in the pattern of the hall floor. Stephen set the letter on the library table. He came to stand in the doorway between the library and the hall, and the geography of it placed him between Eleanor and the assembled party, in a way that said nothing declarative, and nonetheless said a great deal. "The mortgage note on the Marsh cottage," he said, addressing Pembrey directly and with a pleasantness that had no warmth in it at all. "In the principal sum of £240. I would like to retire it this afternoon if Mr. Carver has the instrument with him." Pembrey looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a man realizing that the game he has been playing has been, for quite some time, a different game than he understood. "I have it," Mr. Carver said to the floor. "Then let us have it done," Stephen said. Lady Hargrove said, "Your Grace," in a voice that had undergone a very considerable architectural revision since the morning, low and careful, and stripped of the authority that had filled it for 3 weeks. She said it again with the forms of address working properly now, the weight of the title landing where it was supposed to land. "I was not aware of your identity. Had I known, the matter would have been approached quite differently." "I expect it would," Stephen said. He did not elaborate on this, which was, Eleanor thought, the most precise form of contempt available to a man of his position within the strict social grammar of the age. He did not require elaboration. The room understood him. Lady Hargrove rose from the hall chair. She straightened her back, which had not entirely recovered its former conviction, and she looked at Eleanor with an expression that was making a set of rapid calculations, reordering the ledger of her niece's social value in the light of a figure she had not previously accounted for. And Eleanor watched her do it with a clarity that was almost gentle. She had no anger left to spend on Lady Hargrove. The anger had burned off somewhere between the library door on Thursday and the gate on Friday and the roses in the kitchen window on Saturday morning, and what remained was simply the knowledge of what her aunt was and a willingness to see it accurately. Pembrey took the retired note from Mr. Carver and looked at it, and then at Stephen, and then at Eleanor, and he said, "Well," which was not a sufficient response to the situation, but was apparently all he had available. He folded the note, placed it in his document case, and took his leave with the solicitor behind him, and the sound of the hired carriage on the gravel drive was one of the most satisfying sounds Eleanor had heard in 3 months. Lady Hargrove lingered. She addressed Eleanor in a tone that was attempting courtesy and producing something more complicated. She said that she hoped Eleanor understood she had only ever acted in her interests. She said that the situation had presented itself in a certain light, and she had responded to that light as best she could. She said that she was pleased to see matters resolved so satisfactorily. Eleanor said, "Thank you for coming, Aunt," and meant it in the narrow and precise sense that all social formulas in the Regency world carried their specific weight. And Lady Hargrove understood the formula and accepted it, and took Cooper and the trunks and the hired carriage, and departed for Bath before supper. Mrs. Fenn watched the carriage go from the kitchen window with a cup of tea and the expression of a woman who has held a piece of information for 6 weeks and found the holding entirely worthwhile. The hall was quiet after they were gone. The fire in the library had settled from a blaze to a steady warmth, and the afternoon light had moved from the reading table to the east wall, where it made the spines of the old ledgers visible in the particular amber that preceded the early dark of November. Eleanor was still standing in the library doorway, because she had not moved during the last hour's proceedings, having not been required to, and having found that stillness was the appropriate posture for watching a world rearrange itself around you. Stephen came back into the library. He had been in the estate office with Mr. Carver for the transaction's formalities, and now the transaction was done, and the cottage was hers with no instrument of coercion attached to it, and he came into the library and stood by the reading table with the quiet of a man who has finished a piece of work and is deciding what comes next. He said, "I owe you an account of myself." "You do," she said. "I have been in the habit," he said, "since coming into the title of meeting people in advance of myself, in the way that a man meets them rather than a duke. There are things you learn about the country and the county and the people in it when they are not performing their knowledge of your rank. And things you learn about people," she said, "that you would not learn otherwise." "Yes," he said. He looked at her steadily. "The coat, Miss Marsh, in the rain. You gave a patched coat to a man you had no reason to assist, and you handed it across the gate and walked home in the rain, and you did not wait for thanks, and you did not look back." Eleanor thought of that moment, the gate and the rain, and the way he had said, "That is generous," as if measuring the thing precisely. "It was my father's coat," she said. "It was going to get wet on the peg regardless." "That," he said, with something in his voice that she recognized as the exact expression she had seen him turn on the well-built drainage channel and the repaired north wall, the expression he wore for things that were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, "is precisely what I mean." There was a silence then, the held kind, the kind that is not waiting for something to fill it, but is itself a form of fullness. And Eleanor looked at the fire and the ledgers and the old reading table that she had been borrowing the use of for months, and she thought of the particular quality of the October afternoons spent here. The sound of two people turning pages, the kitchen garden conversation, the weight of being heard. "I should like to know," Stephen said carefully, "whether you would consider remaining in the district." She looked at him. "Not as the solicitor's daughter at the cottage," he said, "though the cottage is yours, unencumbered for as long as you want it. I mean in the district, and at this estate, in a capacity that you and I would need to discuss with some care and at whatever pace you find comfortable." He paused. "I am aware that I have not conducted this as an orthodox courtship. I am aware that I introduced myself under a set of terms that were not entirely straightforward. I would like the chance to correct that." Eleanor considered him. The clean hands, the quiet authority, the way he had stood in the hall doorway between her and Pembury, without announcing himself as a shield. She considered the roses in the kitchen window, pale yellow, from the Ashvale hothouse, with no card. She considered the way he had sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and listened to her speak about drainage and well water levels, with the same calibrated attention he gave to things he considered important. "You might have told me earlier," she said. "I might have," he said. "I'm sorry that I did not." She accepted the apology with a small nod that meant she had registered it and found it sufficient, which was her own form of precision. And she crossed to the reading table and set her hand on the cover of the natural history volume that still lay there from the last visit, the one she had been about to return when the afternoon's events overtook the library. "I shall need to return this," she said. "Keep it," he said. It was never being used. She looked up at him, and the quality of the silence in the room had shifted from the careful, provisional quiet of an ongoing question to something that did not require resolution, because it had already resolved, or had been resolving for 6 weeks without either of them admitting it, across estate gates and kitchen tables, and the long, warm Thursday afternoons in the east light. She kept the book. She crossed the library threshold as herself, entirely, the solicitor's daughter from the Marsh cottage 1 mile down the Wye Valley Road, holding a volume of natural history in a room full of old ledgers and good firelight. The room did not require her to be anything other than what she was. That was, she understood, precisely the point. Mrs. Fenn was in the hall with 2 cups of tea and the careful serenity of a woman who has been waiting a specific number of weeks for a specific outcome and finds it gratifying to have the timing confirmed. She handed 1 cup to Eleanor with the warmth of someone who intends to be a great deal of use going forward. "I'll have your father's coat pressed, Miss Marsh," she said. "I put it over the chair in the east room. I thought you'd want to know where it was." Eleanor took the tea. She thought of the coat folded over the gate in the rain, the first morning, the transaction of it, the plainness of extending a dry thing to a wet person without calculation or motive, or any awareness that the gesture would be measured and found to say everything that needed saying. "Thank you, Mrs. Fenn," she said. Outside, the November dark was coming in across the Wye Valley in the way it did at this time of year, quickly and completely, filling the low places first, and then the road, and then the estate grounds until the only lights were the cottage windows, 1 mile distant, and the Ashvale library behind her, warm and lit. She could see, through the library window, the chair in the east room where the coat lay folded, her father's heavy wool travelling coat, too large for him in the last years, and passed to a stranger in a November rain, and returned carefully across both arms as though it were a thing worth handling. It had been, from the beginning. She had simply not known at the gate that the handling was being noted.